news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. Good piece over at City Journal. The high costs of classroom disorder. One of the things that's tackled here, the main thing really, is chronic student misbehavior in school. And it speaks to a larger problem. One of the consequences of chronic student misbehavior that goes undisciplined, effectively undisciplined, is teachers leave. Talk about this all the time, as much as we rail against the teachers' unions because we should. They're a bulwark against the education of young people. Teachers themselves, you have a lot of very good teachers who leave the profession not because they don't want to teach, but because they can't do what they got into the profession to do, which is to instill a love of learning into children. I know the statistic used to be that in Illinois, half of the teachers leave within the first 3 years. Now, you're always going to have some attrition. People had one idea, and it turned out to be something else, the other opportunities, whatever, of course. But that seems like a very high rate of attrition for people that, have a real passion for educating young people, but they can't do in these systems what they got into the profession to do. Just won't allow it. The centrally planned nature of them. There's a lot of reasons, and it's certainly not the compensation. Not for most of them. Chicago public school teachers, pre this new $1.5 billion contract, were already the highest paid public school teachers in the nation, adjusted for cost of living. It's not that. It's not the pay and the benefits. I'm not in a position to do what I want to do when it comes to getting kids on the path to being successful, independent adults, lifelong learners. The problem may be the approach that's being taken here with respect to student misbehavior, which is one of the issues, and it's a big one. I think it's a bigger one than sometimes we recognize. When we do raise this issue, or where there is an incident where a teacher is injured by a student, for example, you get all this flood of reaction from teachers like, you don't know what's going on in the classroom. This happens all too frequently. It's happened to me, or it's happened to colleagues. This sounds a little bit like we're talking about violent crime in places like Chicago and Washington, D.C. It's not a problem, it's under control. And then you talk to the people that actually are in the problem areas, and they say, no, it's not under control. For more on this, get into it, pleased to be joined by Neetu Arnold, Paulson Policy Analyst at the Manhattan Institute and a Young Voices contributor. Neetu, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi, good morning. And I think this is a great way to set up the conversation. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Oh, thank you very much. That's why they pay me the big bucks, Neetu. So tell us about positive behavioral interventions and supports, also known as PBIS by no one, but tell us what that is.
Well, thank you. I was really interested in learning more about positive behavior interventions and supports. It's a behavior management framework that a lot of schools use, more than 25,000 schools now across the country. And it focuses on rewarding positive behavior and relies on non-punitive measures to deal with student misconduct. And so, I think a lot of people, especially teachers, if you tell them what PBIS is, they know it. But I felt like outside of the teacher circles, most people have probably not heard of PBIS. And I was interested in looking into this issue because among teachers, I kept hearing the same story over and over again. teacher sends misbehaving student to the principal's office. That student comes back with a bag of chips, and the student's behavior doesn't change. And every time the story was told, the teachers kept blaming PBIS. And so that's why I wanted to look into this issue, because it's just widely adopted in schools.
So it's multi-tiered. You go through it.
Right.
So Tier 1 set conduct expectations. Tier 2 provides support for students who don't respond, like staff check-ins. And Tier 3 is individualized strategies for those with serious behavioral challenges. It feels very, just the way it's being described, and then you know more about this in terms of detail, but if it just reads as sort of very gooey, very sort of like, we're going to stop the school to prison pipeline rhetoric you hear from educators or administrators who don't want to punish kids for not just misbehavior, but even punish kids for committing actual crimes.
I mean, the PBIS structure, the idea is that's supposed to offer targeted support based on what the student needs. And so, as you said, Tier 1, it applies to the general student population. And if there are students who have, or, they're struggling with more issues, there are more specific interventions. And the concept, I don't see anything wrong in the concept itself over that, but it is the way it's being applied. And you are right that this is tied with a lot of the anti-discipline, anti-zero tolerance measures. The history of PBIS is actually a little interesting, because it was originally supposed to be aimed at students with behavior disorders, which is a small subset of the student population. But as people became more interested in addressing the school to prison pipeline, there was this concern that if they're disciplining students or suspending them or expelling them, that those students are more likely to drop out and then somehow end up in the criminal justice system because they're committing crimes. So the idea was to keep students in classes and make sure that they're decreasing suspensions, but it was often at the expense of students who didn't do anything wrong. It's also at the expense of good instruction. Many of the teachers I was speaking to, they were telling me that because discipline was not handled effectively, they're often dealing with the consequences in classes. And in the worst case scenarios, they're dealing with student roughhousing, fighting, threats. And because they're so busy dealing with maintaining a classroom environment, they're not able to offer the best education to students.
Well, and this is no defense to zero tolerance policies either, at least not
Right.
for me, because, we got into the silliness where adults weren't using a good judgment, and somebody makes a gun with his index finger and thumb and points it at another kid, and then he's suspended for an act of violence. And there's a lot school lockdown and squirt guns and things like this. I mean, it was over the top.
Right.
So you have to make judgment calls here, but it just, we talked about this actually not long ago in the context of school shooters, going back to the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, where there were a lot of opportunities to intervene with the kid who ultimately killed all those other kids. And the posture was end the school to prison pipeline, alternative dispute resolution, more support services, check-ins. It was all very gooey. But when he was making threats and other and there are other examples of this too, it was the response wasn't punitive enough to make it clear that there are lines here, or we're watching you or we're going to punish you as soon as you cross that line. That seems to me what's lost here. And it goes back to basically on a case-by-case basis with some broad principles, like keep your hands keep your hands to yourself and respect your neighbor kind of thing. And if you don't, there's going to be consequences. It seems to me that's lost, and zero tolerance took it too far one way, and things like the system you're describing take it too far the other.
Well, right. And I don't think the problem was with the idea of discipline itself. It was the fact that it was taken too far. And what you're seeing from the critics of these harsh discipline policies, they're essentially like we should not have discipline at all, or we should decrease it and make it more relaxed. And I think that's why we have the problems we're seeing in schools today, because we're losing our standards, we're losing that transparency. And again, it's felt by the students, and it's also felt by the teachers.
So tell us about this this aspect. Everything is these are supposed to be like accountability metrics, but all of this feels very much like accountability theater. The tiered fidelity inventory score, the TFI score that's associated with the PBIS system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was really important to understanding what PBIS is really about, because I think it can get confusing when you're talking to teachers and they tell you that PBIS is leading to chaos. But if you talk to the PBIS trainers, they're kind of confused, and they're like, what are you talking about? PBIS is supposed to have accountability, and we support punitive measures, and I think anyone who is caught in the middle of that conversation, they're going to get confused. And so that's why you have to look at what the tiered fidelity inventory says. The TFI is a rubric that schools use to check if they are implementing PBIS correctly. They look at whether data is being reported correctly, if data collection is good, what is the communication management like, all of that is fine. But if you look at some other aspects, how do you deal with student misbehavior? That's where you start to see some interesting things going on. And what I found was that it's not as flexible of a framework as PBIS trainers would have you believe, that they support both lenient and punitive policies. So a school is out of compliance if they only have reactive or punitive policies, but they're in full compliance if they have restorative practices, which, by the way, is not supported by evidence. Restorative justice, restorative practices, whatever names you want to go by, it's not well supported by research. It doesn't even have a good evidence base. Schools have to decrease suspensions. They have to move away from restraints. And so the incentive structures that are given, which you can see in the TFI, it's giving administrators the incentive to rely less on suspensions and expulsions. And this is what is being borne out by the teacher interviews I had. The message I constantly got from the teachers is that the administrators were using PBIS. They ended up using PBIS as a crutch to ignore student misbehavior. And it makes sense if you go to the accountability, the rubric. It makes sense why.
And with respect to the scoring of whether schools are in compliance, you also suggest that we have some identitarian politics afoot here, which is unsurprising, that there needs to be sort of equitable representation in the discipline that is meted out.
Right. They are asking schools to look at the data and to make sure that racial disparities are avoided, which, again, I think that's very flawed, because there's this assumption that if there are racial disparities in suspensions or expulsions, in other words, certain groups are more represented in suspensions or expulsions than others, that means discrimination has occurred.
Right.
And you can't make that assumption automatically. You're going to need more evidence. You're going to need evidence of intent. But more importantly, it's very possible that there are just differences in behavior outcomes. And if you're not suspending or expelling students just because you want to maintain a certain racial balance, you're still putting many students and many teachers in harm's way.
What kind of data do we have on the incidence of student violence? Where students have committed crimes. Yes, in the direction of their fellow students, but also in front of it, with respect to teachers or administrators, adults in the system. Is there any sort of measure on this? Is there any sort of understanding of where we are in terms of this being more or less frequent than it was, say, pre-pandemic?
So the data on suspensions and on incidences, it varies by state. It even varies by school. And so some places they're quite detailed. You can get like the infraction level data. You can get suspensions, expulsions, a whole host of things. There are other places where you're looking for suspension data, but maybe you want to know why the student was suspended, and you're not going to get that information so easily. It's kind of all over the place, in my opinion, and that's why I think we need better data. And we shouldn't be looking at just the suspensions to check if a school is improving student behavior. Just because you see suspensions go down, it doesn't mean the behavior is improved. It could just be that the school is moving away from suspensions because of the incentives given to them, such as programs like PBIS. That was something that was told to me by someone who works with this kind of data closely. And, she told me that sometimes principals have some pressure to make their suspension data look a certain way.
Yeah, right.
So that they don't get called out by some higher up. So that's where you're going to get the distortion. But I think that's why we need better data, and not just relying on suspensions or expulsions, but also just the actual infraction.
Yeah, it's sort of like some of the same conversations we're having about general crime stats right now. The other thing you suggest is there's studies that have looked at this system that purport to say that it's really working, but you talk about some flaws in those studies that have reviewed this PBIS system, and that there's a lot of sort of methodological questions in terms of comparing apples to oranges and categorical errors and so forth.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this was a really crucial part of the piece, actually diving into the research, because it's a big selling point for schools to adopt the program. I mean, if you have 200 plus studies and they're showing that this program is effective at improving student behavior, I mean, you should go adopt that program. But when you actually look into the research, especially the highest quality research, there are some weaknesses, and I think fundamental flaws. And, again, I would recommend your listeners to go read the article, because I'm going to be scratching the surface here. But one of the biggest flaws I found was just that, again, the studies are relying on consequence data like suspensions and expulsions as evidence that misbehavior or, behavior has improved. And, you just can't make that assumption. Something else that I noticed was that a lot of the PBIS trainings now are trying to incorporate restorative practices, restorative justice into PBIS, but the studies that I looked at did not mention restorative justice or practices. And so a lot of schools are probably adopting a very different program than what was studied in the first place.
Very interesting. Neetu Arnold is a Paulson policy analyst at the Manhattan Institute and a Young Voices contributor. Her piece, The High Costs of Classroom Disorder, worth a look, and I will post it on X as well. Neetu, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
And she joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
They took everything. Our equipment, our supplies.